I think we have some party crashers because I could swear we had enough chairs, but they keep bringing in more. To those here with us at the Lotus Club, those viewing live, and those watching sometime later, welcome to the 21st Annual Story Prize event. We're here to honor 3 outstanding, inventive short story collections. Highway 13 by Fiona McFarlane, There Is a Rio Grande in Heaven by Ruben Reyes Jr., and Ghost Pains by Jessi Jezewska, is that good, Jessi? Stevens. Close. The 3 finalists will each read from their books, then discuss their work with me. At the end of the evening, Jay Lindsay, the president of the Chisholm Foundation, which has generously backed the Story Prize from the outset, will announce the winner. We read 107 collections published by 82 different presses or imprints in 2024. So what made these books stand out? Each is so original in conception and distinctive in style that only the person who wrote them could have done so. We chose the finalists. 3 independent judges determined the winner, which we'll announce at the end of the evening. The judges were writer and editor Elliot Holt, who I think was coming. I don't see her. Writer Maurice Carlos Ruffin, and bookseller Lucy Yu. All 3 short story collections that are finalists for the Story Prize this year take fresh and imaginative approaches to short fiction. These books also feature a global variety of settings. Among them, I'm just going to name the countries, because if I had to break it down by city, it would take forever. Australia, El Salvador, Germany, Italy, Poland, Switzerland, and the US, and the stories even venture as far as Mars. They range in time from 1950 to 2175, including the indeterminate present and the recent past. We hope you'll buy, and more importantly, read Highway 13, There Is a Rio Grande in Heaven, and Ghost Pains. Here at the club, signed copies are available for purchase from 192 Books. And if you're watching online, we've included a link to a list posted on bookshop.org. I'd also like to mention one other short story collection we read in 2024, The History of Sound by Ben Shattuck, which is this year's winner of the Story Prize Spotlight Award. Before we start, I'd like to thank Julie and Jay Lindsay for their decades-long support of the Story Prize. I'd also like to thank Asher Dark, who assisted me in getting, tracking, and reading the 107 books we received, as well as helping with social media, and Melissa Olcott, who takes care of the many logistics involved in organizing this event. Okay, we're ready to go. The first finalist we'll hear from tonight is Fiona McFarlane. If I were to tell you that Highway 13 is a collection about an Australian serial killer active in the 1980s and 90s, you'd likely assume that the stories focus on the killer, his crimes, and his victims. But McFarlane eschews that obvious strategy and instead ingeniously centers her stories on the far-reaching effects the killer had on a variety of peripheral characters, as well as on the young woman who would turn out to be the mother of this unseen monster. In doing so, Highway 13, which is named for the road near Sydney, Australia, where the killer stalked his victims, steers clear of lurid sensationalism, underscoring how violence affects even those at a remote, and how long these acts can continue to resonate. Fiona.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a few pages from the beginning of a short story called Abroad. It's quite unrepresentative in the sense that it's the only one of the stories that's actually set in the United States, in Austin, Texas, a place I lived for 3 years, in a very unlikely fashion for an Australian. It's set in 2011. The witch rings the doorbell at 9:30. a full hour after the last trick-or-treater, and she appears to be alone. When Simon opens the door to her, she frightens him a little. She's so small and imperfectly green, as if someone began the job of colouring her face with gusto and then grew bored. Her hat is regulation, tall and conical, with a broad brim and a yellow buckle, but she wears a black t-shirt, black trousers, and a pair of purple high-top Converse. An off-duty witch, carrying a broom and one of those orange plastic buckets shaped like a pumpkin. She looks up at Simon without saying trick or treat, without saying anything. And Simon looks back at her, unsure of how to proceed. He's English and doesn't understand American Halloween, but he's married to an American and lives in America, and finds now that he has no choice. The souls of the dead have risen, and he must, for one night, live among them. "Hello," says Simon. Behind him in the house, he can hear Sunny on the phone arguing with her mother. The night is mild, because this is Texas, and its late October climate is gloriously hospitable. The witch adjusts her grip on the broom. She looks about 10 years old, and someone has drawn a large wart on the tip of her nose. She says, "I know you probably don't have any good candy left." Simon glances at her pumpkin, which looks to be fairly full of shiny wrappers, but he doesn't know enough about American candy to interpret the quality of what he sees. He does know now that peanut butter kisses are not the same thing as Reese's peanut butter cups, because when he brought the former home from H-E-B, Sunny laughed at him and said she should have known better than to send an Englishman out to buy Halloween candy. To Sunny, Simon had defended himself by pointing out that American Halloween was a commercial bastardization of an ancient Celtic festival, something much darker and older than the constitution of this fanatical country, and that the day he understood Halloween candy would be the day he gave up on being British. I'm not British, by the way, I'm Australian, just want to mention that. To the witch, he says, "I'll bring the candy bowl, shall I, and let you be the judge." When he steps into the dining room to fetch the bowl, Sunny, in her American way, would say, "Grab the bowl," which seems to Simon unnecessarily violent. Sunny comes to the door of the kitchen, dressed as a pirate in white ruffles, a tight vest and a long skirt. Her shoulders are bare and brown. She muffles her cell phone against one hand and says, "It's so late, who is it, teens? Teens are the worst." Then she returns the phone to her ear and says, "Okay, Mommy, but you have to look at it from his point of view. He works for an airline." They're arguing about Sunny's brother, who for the third year in a row has disappointed his mother by claiming he's too busy at work to come home to Sacramento for Thanksgiving. Sunny, too, is annoyed with Anil, but she's justifying his decision in order to spare her mother's feelings. She strides back into the kitchen with bare feet, her pirate skirt hitched up and tucked rakishly into her wide belt, so that she's showing most of one leg. She's magnificent, and the only thing in the world that could possibly have convinced Simon to move to Texas. Simon returns to the front door, carrying the mostly empty bowl, which is shaped like a cauldron. "What do you think?" he asks. "Anything past muster?" The witch stands on her toes in order to peer into the bowl, even though Simon has held it low enough for her easy inspection. Perhaps this is a witch thing, the narrowing of the eyes, these tiptoes. Perhaps it's witch etiquette around a cauldron. "Okay, so it's kind of dark in there," she says. "Can we tip it out? I want to make sure I pick the best one." "Why not?" says Simon, who in most situations also prefers to pick the best one. He takes unexpected pleasure in pouring the contents of the cauldron onto the front porch. When his older sister was going through her early adolescent pre-Raphaelite phase, she'd had a poster on her bedroom wall of a beautiful witch standing on a sea monster and pouring a glowing liquid into the waves from a wide, shallow bowl. Simon, much younger, had been frightened by the pale bulge of the witch's breast as much as the domesticated sea monster. He remembers this image now as the little witch crouches to inspect the candy. It feels menacing to loom above her. So Simon also lowers himself into a squat, carefully, because he's dressed in a kilt, which he wore as a groomsman at his best friend's wedding. This is the closest he's willing to come to a Halloween costume. "These are pretty good," says the witch, poking with one contemplative green finger at the bright packages on the porch. She's let her broom fall against the railings, but grips the handle of her pumpkin bucket as if she's afraid it might be snatched from her at any moment. A group of teenagers goes careening by. They're each dressed as a different condiment. Hot Sauce has taken a clump of Spanish moss, probably from the boughs of one of Carol West's beloved magnolias 3 houses down, and is wearing it as a crown, like a Dickensian Christmas ghost. "It's quite late," Simon says to the witch. "Are you out on your own?" The witch, bending over her candy, her hat still atop her head, must be held on by elastic, sighs as if she's disappointed in him for asking such a tiresome question. "I live 1 street over. You can hear my house." Simon listens. He can hear a low, thumping bass, and only now realizes that it's provided a steady heartbeat to the entire evening. "They're having a party?" Simon asks. "Uh-huh," says the witch. Her small hand hovers above a miniature Snickers. She shifts her weight from one folded leg to another, then looks up at Simon. Her green eyes are startling in her green face. She says, "Some people give out full-size candy bars." Simon nods. "So my wife tells me." "But you have to be early before the other kids. Did you have full-size ones?" Simon shakes his head. "My wife thinks they're excessive." The witch thinks this over and shrugs. "It's only once a year," she says. Simon hears Sunny's high barking laugh, the one that signals both incredulity and an almost regretful dismay. She often resorts to this laugh while on the phone with her mother. "How about," says Simon, "you choose a chocolate bar and I'll get my wife and we'll walk you home." "I'll grab my wife," he thinks. The witch's eyes return to the pile of candy glittering at her feet. "How about," she says, reproducing Simon's exact tone and inflection, "I get 2 of these, since they're not full size." Simon considers resisting these terms until he hears a scream in the night, a pitchy, garbled shriek of what appears to be genuine fright, which may have come from 2 blocks away or from the shuttered attic of the house next door, and he's reminded again that the dead are abroad, whether he likes it or not. Then it seems to him unwise to try to bargain for anything on this particular night, in case he binds himself or the witch to some devilish contract. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that.
A pleasure.
I think the first question to ask is, what relationship does Simon bear to this serial killer?
Right, so if I'd read for another minute or so, you may have discovered this. He is the younger brother, much younger brother, of a young woman who, when she was 19 years old, went on vacation to Australia and vanished. They don't know what happened to her. They don't know whether or not she's connected in any way to this particular serial killer. But the reader is left to infer that there is a relationship there.
So his concern for this young girl who's alone reflects sort of the experience of losing a sister.
It does, and he's also, I suppose he's having a strange night in the sense that his relationship to the dead and the unquiet dead is quite personal. And so he's suddenly encountering this kind of Halloween which doesn't exist in Britain anymore, and is a kind of carnival of the undead. He's very drawn to the fact that there are plastic gravestones on lawns that say things like "Bon Voyage," etc. And he's trying to reconcile, in some ways, the I suppose the carnival aspects of that, and then the actual loss that he and his family experienced.
When you were working on this book and you told your agent or your editor that you were writing a book on this subject, but you were not going to touch on directly on the crimes, what was the reaction? Was there an entreaty to maybe put in one story that shows?
Well, both my agent and editor are here tonight. Perhaps they can answer that, but I'm not sure that I ever even told them. I think I just began writing books about an Australian serial killer who never appeared in any of the stories. But I've known both of these women for a very long time, and I'm very lucky that they trust me entirely. So I never felt anyone any pressure for someone to say, "Can we please see a murder in this collection?" Not at all.
Did you conceive of this before you wrote any of the stories, or did this emerge from a story or two that you had written?
It emerged from the very first story in the book, which is called Tourists, and is about, it's set much more locally about the town in which the serial killer turns out to have lived. And I wrote that story sort of in relation to this potentially unnerving obsession I developed with true crime podcasts that got me thinking about why we tell stories about true crime, why we listen to them, how they circulate, who circulates them, all of those sorts of questions. And so once I'd written this first story, which is sort of about people who were interested in going to the scenes of crimes or where killers lived, which is a fascinating sort of psychological thing to decide to do, I thought, actually, there's more here that I want to explore. But it's not a novel. I want to spend sort of episodes with different people who've had encounters in some way, whether close like Simon or distantly like the actor in a limited series in which he's playing the serial killer. I wanted to explore true crime storytelling rather than the murders themselves.
Another interesting thing about the book is that the stories, each one has a year affixed to it, but they're not in chronological order. What is the logic behind the order? Why did you do it that way?
Well, the very last story in the book is the earliest story chronologically that takes place. And I think if you were to read that particular story, which sort of tells how the parents of the serial killer came together, I think if you were to read that earlier in the book, it wouldn't carry the same kind of weight that it does. So by the time you read it at the end, hopefully you have this sense of the consequence of the decision that every character is making within it, even though everything that happens is quite ordinary. And I suppose I was thinking about the way when something terrible happens to a person or to a community or to a family member, time changes. It's not just from that moment onward. It also reflects back into the past.
Right.
And the stories we tell about the past change in relation to the thing that happens and that looms over everything. So I really wanted to bring that home at the end of the book, that this story seems to have nothing to do with anything else, and yet everything else that happens in this book could never have taken place without that final story.
Even the name of the killer takes a little while to emerge in the stories. It's not in the first story, I don't think, or the second story at least. So that's a really interesting approach also. So were you thinking about the stories, the order of the stories, sort of following the different aspects of the relationships to him? I mean, I think it works beautifully, but it is interesting because I think most people, well, they would show the killer, but they would also probably go chronologically, I think. And I think one of the pleasures of reading the book, for those who haven't read it, is at a certain point you understand where you know what this book is, and you know that there's some aspect of the story that's touching on this killer, his crimes. It could be a victim, it could be a police officer who arrested the killer. It could be someone who lived next door to him when he was growing up. So you're sort of hunting you're searching for that connection. You're trying to figure out, where's this going to come in? How does this relate to the whole? That's not really a question. That's an observation.
Thank you, though. I think it speaks to the way in which reading is a kind of detective story, and we enter into a story trying to pull the pieces of it together and make our own sense of it. I think that's one way to think about reading, and that's an aspect of reading that I absolutely wanted to draw on in this book. You have to put the story of the killer together, and you could choose whether or not you want to do that. And it turns the reader into a kind of detective on a case, which was absolutely one of those sort of ideas I had early on and hoped I could pull off.
And it just doesn't go even to the present. It goes a little bit into the future with the podcast.
It does.
Where I assume that sister of that man has been found after all these years, which is pretty amazing when you get to that, I think.
Right, so that is one of the ways in which the stories speak to one another, is that you eventually encounter the transcript of a true crime podcast in which a new victim is discovered, and we as the reader can infer that it is in fact the sister of Simon who you just met.
So are the stories in the order that you wrote them, or no?
No, not at all. The last story I wrote is somewhere in the middle. It's entirely one sentence, which I didn't choose to read to you this evening. And it is called Democracy Sausage. Right. If there are any other Australians in the room, you will understand that we all have to vote in every federal election, and they sweeten that deal by feeding us barbecued sausages while we do so. And that's why it's called Democracy Sausage. I always knew that I wanted to write one story about a politician who, at the very worst moment, turns out to have the same surname as the killer. So that is the very last story that I wrote, but it appears in the middle of the book.
And what does the button say that he's wearing, because he does have the last name?
Well, the surname he and the killer both have is Biega. It's a Polish surname. I can't remember, to be honest now. Okay. He has something like...
Not related or something?
That's right. He has a pin that says not related or no relation.
Right.
But then halfway through the story, his campaign manager realizes that that's tracking poorly. And so he removes the no relation, but feels this unnerving sense that he is thereby claiming some relation.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this the killer you base this on? I imagine this is someone very well known in Australia.
Yes, any Australian reader would know exactly who he's based on, although he is himself fictional. But there is a particular killer who was operating in the Sydney area in the 90s when I was a teenager, who had the kind of effect on me that stories like this often do, an effect of disquiet, of fascination, of fear. And that's part of what I wanted to explore by thinking about stories like this one, why we're drawn to them, why we listen to them, why we retell them, and find connections to them.
So do you think Australian readers read it differently because they know of the person it's based on, or do you think it doesn't really change?
It doesn't really change. I mean, I think that's probably the case. There is one story in here, it's called Fat Suit, and it is about the man who is playing the serial killer. And he's an Australian who's been living in the United States, and his wife is American. And she says, take this role, it's a meaty, complex part. And he says, you don't understand, this is like playing Ted Bundy, this is like playing Jack the Ripper. And she's like, oh yes, I know. And the book sort of comments at that point that he knows that she thinks that Australian serial killers are less, that it's not as frightening, that the violence is smaller, that the grief is smaller, which is of course not the case. But the book, I think, is, and I am conscious of the ways in which in which this particular killer it's based on is very, very Australian. But I think at the same time, this fascination we have with true crime is fairly international. Most of the true crime podcasts I listen to are American. Yeah.
So you're still fascinated with true crime even after
Absolutely
spending all this time with
That's
the
how
book.
I clean my house. Yeah.
Is it a lot less? I imagine it's a lot less common in Australia having serial killers, maybe just because of the size of the population.
No, we're quite good at them. Unfortunately, we're overrepresented represented in Hollywood and maybe also serial killing. I'm afraid. I'm not proud of that, but it is true.
So you could do a sequel with a different killer.
Oh God, yes, I probably could, but I don't think I will.
Yeah, there's even, just to give a sense of the book, there's even a hero who comes up in the book. Do you know what I'm referring to? Because there's one person who escaped, one young woman, and she's the one who led the police to arrest the killer. And she comes in a very interesting way. Do you want to just talk about that story and that character a little bit?
Sure. She again is sort of based on a real person, very, very unlike her, but I want to mention him simply because his name is Paul Onions, which I think is so delightful that anyone would have the surname Onions. She is the one person who has an encounter with the killer and is able to ID him, but does get away from him. And we do encounter her in a short story that happens long before her trip to Australia. Mm-hmm. She is on a school history trip to Rome with a very organised nun. So she sort of appears. I think the word hero is one that she would probably step away from. One of the things that I was really interested in writing this book, and that I've also been interested in as I've listened to these podcasts over the last sort of 5 to 8 years, is a shift into a kind of ethical interest in what it means to tell stories about true crime, and how terms like hero and villain and sort of that aspect of kind of sensationalizing or romanticizing or glamorizing certain aspects or victimizing, etc. All of those things have become more sort of present in the narrative that's taking place. And that was one of my an impetus for the book was to say, can I write a book about a serial killer in which the serial killer never appears? There's no obvious hero,
right.
There's no obvious detective, there's no obvious villain. This is about ordinary people in moments of tenderness and confusion and good and bad behaviour. So I think Grace, who is, at one point the podcast hosts are talking about making an action figure of her. Yeah. I think she would be horrified by that and step away from that concept of heroism.
Once you had this idea, what were the challenges of writing the different stories? I mean, how did you come up with the idea of, I want a story about this relationship to Paul Biga?
I didn't approach it that way, actually. I encountered characters and became interested in their lives, and the relationship between them and the murders arose, I suppose. So there's one short story in here that is about a retired flight attendant, and that came about because I was flying on an overnight flight from Perth to Sydney, and the man behind me was a retired flight attendant who talked for the entire 5-hour flight. And that is why there's a story in this book in which there is a male retired flight attendant. But I just got interested in what he was saying about this town in Northern Australia that flight attendants all retire to, and I became interested in him as a human being. So those thematic elements of the book are all there, and certainly in the revision I was sort of thinking more consciously about those. But as I wrote each story, I thought of it as its own world, and I wanted to think about those people in their world rather than how they connected in obvious ways.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it work, is that you could read any of these stories apart from the collection and not even necessarily know that the flight attendants sister, I won't give a spoiler, but was about to marry or did marry. She did marry Paul Beeg, I believe.
His landlady's sister, yes, did marry Paul.
Right.
So some of the stories, the connection is very sort of, it's not particularly close. It's quite tangential.
Was it fun to come up with those tangential kind of connections? What connection are you most sort of proud of that you were able to establish through a story?
Oh, the one I had the most fun was a story called Hostel, which is written in the first person, and it is a woman telling the story of her friends who tell the story of the time they met a woman who may have been one of the murderer's victims.
Right.
Which speaks to the book's interest in the telling of these stories rather than in the actual events themselves. And that was enormous fun to sort of include all of those layers and get in all of the ways in which we find these stories, we can find them both horrifying and off-putting and also sort of delectable. So I think that story was probably the one that I took, that I relished writing the most.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go back up here. Thanks, Fiona. The second finalist is Ruben Reyes Jr. In the collection, There Is a Rio Grande in Heaven, Reyes plays with form and genre to explore the experience of people from El Salvador living in and migrating to the US. The result is stories that involve a dead father brought back to life by his son as a tiny robot, a research project set in the year 2175 that uncovers a legacy of a buried story, a reggaeton riff on Kafka's Metamorphosis, a grandmother who slowly becomes a puppet as she ages, a story about environmental devastation and resettlement on Mars, and a choose-your-own-adventure about migration to the US from El Salvador, with most choices leading to horrific endings. Between stories, Reyes explores alternate histories of El Salvador, a country with a turbulent history. Ruben, come on up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, first of all. And I also want to take the time to thank everyone working this event and the people that are going to break it down and clean up once we're done. So I'm going to read from a story that is special to me because it's the first story I ever published publicly online as part of the Florida Review's, Latinx History Month portfolio a couple years ago. And it's about my grandma, and it's not about my grandma. So it's called My Abuela the Puppet. I have been a fan of metaphor since I learned to read, first in English and then eventually in rusty copper Spanish. This is not a metaphor. My grandma has become a puppet. Abuela's body started to change slowly 10 years ago. Though she was human then, her physique lent itself to a description of a marionette. She had clunky white orthopedic shoes that looked oversized and cartoonish when she took her small, concerted steps. Abuela's back was permanently hunched over, as if she were suspended by invisible strings at the shoulders. She lost a lot of weight, and the lack of fat in her face, combined with her wrinkled skin, made her head look huge. But Abuela was still herself then, flesh and bones and dust. When she became a puppet, no one knew what to do about it. Papi wouldn't admit it, but there were signs that her metamorphosis was coming. It wasn't just those dreadful orthopedic shoes. For a long time, Abuela lived in an apartment by herself. Her relationship with my abuelo had been another one of the precious things lost to migration, and she never bothered dating again. She had her children, who joined her in the United States after she'd been cleaning houses, theaters, and embassies for nearly a decade for just above minimum wage. But of course, Papi and his siblings had grown up and left Abuela in that musty-smelling apartment building. She initially resisted the arrangement, but preferred it to a nursing home. Abuela had always valued her independence. We visited her one afternoon and couldn't avoid the putrid smell that snuck into her home. The whole building smelled of old person. Less kindly, the carpet and walls reeked of dying. But that morning, the odor in Abuelita's apartment stank of something already dead. In the fridge, there were rotten casseroles and the unquestionable stink of not-so-fresh queso fresco. Papi managed to save 5 slices from the loaf of bread, but everything else went into the trash. Abuela claimed she hadn't smelled the food going bad. Her nose hardly worked anymore, she told us in an attempt to gain our pity. We went with her to the supermarket and bought a cart full of groceries. 2 weeks later, they still sat in the fridge, largely untouched and mostly spoiled. "I'm just not hungry," she told us when confronted. Over the next couple of months, we repeated the routine, giving her the benefit of the doubt, until her arms began to look like a well-loved rag doll's. Eventually, Mami convinced Papi to let Abuela move into our home in the suburbs. Abuela said they were being ridiculous, that she was fine in her apartment, that she was happy. But Mami was worried she'd fall one day and no one would be there to help her. The weight loss worried her. Abuelita had a large gut throughout my childhood, the kind that makes you wonder what would happen if you tipped her over and tried rolling her down the street. But by the time she moved into my old bedroom, her gut was gone. If you tipped her over, she'd plop onto the sidewalk like a plank of wood. There's a purse Abuela loves. It's a knockoff Louis Vuitton that she picked up in MacArthur Park a year or so before the rotting fridge fiasco. When she became a puppet, a version of the bag stayed stitched to her side, though it was made of felt and had less detail than the original. The print has lost all its definition. The letter and shapes are indistinguishable from one another, forming no more than a muddled slate of gold and brown fabric. But the purse sticks to her side, even as she lies tossed over a chair. Before she was a puppet, Abuela swung that purse around and hit Papi straight across the cheek, leaving him with neck pains he'd complain about for weeks. She was accusing him of stealing money from her. Papi assured her that no, he hadn't touched her wallet, but she continued. She remembered putting a stack of $20 bills in the small pocket of her purse, and now she couldn't find it. Papi had stolen them, she yelled. The ungrateful hijo de su padre. She pulled back her flabby arm and took aim, slamming the purse hard against his face. In his moment of shock, Abuela made a run for it. She pushed past me with the strength that her lip marionette arms no longer possess. The woman who sang me lullabies about baby chicks and coyotes lay her hands on me without any tenderness. She opened the front door and ran out into the rain-soaked neighborhood with her Louis Vuitton fake. I stayed in the doorway to her bedroom, immobile. Abuela had fallen into moments of rage before, but the normal kind anyone is susceptible to. She barked at waiters when they forgot my order. At weddings or funerals, she joked when it was clear I or my cousins needed a pick-me-up. Her love was clear, quietly expressed in both words and actions. She cared for me, had never hurt me before. When she shoved me, I froze under the chill of a betrayal I'd fight to forget, even after it became clear that her body was betraying her. Rationalizing the hurt didn't make it disappear. I wanted to cry. Mami and Papi got into the minivan and went out searching for her. They spotted her through a sprinkled windshield waiting at the wrong bus stop. Her plan, my parents told me after I'd wiped the bags under my eyes dry, was to ride the bus back to her apartment. She had forgotten the bus route to get there, though she'd ridden it for nearly a decade. It slipped her mind that she no longer had a lease on that musty pink apartment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. How did you decide to take the approach to this collection of sort of these, some are genre influenced stories, some are fantastical. What drove you to do that rather than pursue, more realistic kind of stories?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think a lot of these stories, I feel like the first book is really interesting because you're learning what kind of writer you had to be, and I learned to be a writer through short stories. And I really knew I was onto something when I started playing with genre a little bit more. I find that like speculative fiction is actually a way of getting to the truth for me, especially when I write about immigration, which is so polarized. And like, you know, if you want the truth about immigration, you can read the news, right? But someone is not gonna, you know, someone might read it, forget about it. Someone might read it, not believe it. And fiction gave me a new avenue to kind of ask the questions I wanted to ask. And so that's basically how I started. I also just was a big sci-fi and fantasy reader. One of my favorite authors, maybe my favorite American author, is Ray Bradbury. And he also, I think, did that thing where he talked about the United States and his community as he was seeing it, but at an angle, which is what I try to do.
Did you find any resistance to taking that approach to writing these stories? Because I think a lot of times people like to have a dividing line between genre and what's literary.
Yeah, that's a great question. Not really. I feel like I was really lucky that I'm coming at a great time in publishing where I think like this strain of like speculative fiction, which is a term I wouldn't have known, I think like a decade ago, has given me a lot of freedom to play around with form and to, I consider myself a writer of literary fiction as well, and maybe first and foremost, but like, I also am gonna play with the sci-fi tropes and the stuff I loved growing up. It was, another thing I'll say is that during my MFA, my classmates were really helpful in talking about this, but I was doing a different thing than most of them. A lot of them were writing, short stories that were more realist. And I think at that time in my life, it was nice to feel that I had my little lane, and that I had people that would take me seriously and read me seriously, but who were doing different things in their own work than mine. It's like it gave me the freedom a little bit to, I wasn't going to be influenced by their stories, right? At least not in a really direct way.
Did you have any ideas that were so sort of out there that you actually didn't really get to write that story because it was maybe too hard to wrestle to the ground?
Oh yeah, tons. I like the reason, hearing you basically say the concepts of these stories was so funny because there's a lot in here, is what I realized hearing you. And that's because I love the idea stage. I always have a lot of ideas. And the real work for me is starting something and figuring out, how you make it not just a concept, but a full story that does everything a good short story does. And so there were some failed experiments along the way. Something I don't love doing that I did and then gave up on and then have recently revisited is write from a dream.
Right.
So I think it's silly to write about your dreams, but I had a dream that everything in my fridge came back to life and was like in my apartment. And I need to write that story. So so sometime in the future, maybe in the next collection, people can read that one.
So did like the bottle of ketchup talk, or
it was
they
like
were just sitting
like
there?
The chicken cutlets, were clucking and walking around, and the leather boots were cows once more or whatnot. I don't. For some reason, that dream, I was like, I need to write about this.
Yeah. Well, keep trying. It sounds like it'll be a good one. I think I summarized every story in the book, but what I didn't touch on so much is there are these sort of interludes, which you call an alternate history of El Salvador. What was your thinking behind that, and how does that tie it together? Yeah,
it makes the table of contents look a little wild because they all have the same title, and so it appears 5 times throughout the collection. That was actually, oh my God, how did I end up there? I think I'm really obsessed with this question of alternate histories and what if. I find it a really moving, regardless of how a writer approaches it, I find it a really moving kind of topic. And so I think I was playing with it, and eventually I had, maybe 7 of these, and I was like, I'm at my MFA, I need a story. What if I just put them together and see what people think? And I had a really interesting workshop, and they were all pretty short, like these are. And there were just like a ton of questions about what is the relationship between this one and this one? Like, are we supposed to read them chronologically or not? And then the genius short story writer, Jamel Brinkley, was like, in the way he, like, very casually was like, what if you, in a book, spread them apart? And I was like, okay, well, that's it. You solved it for me. And then the work was to figure out, of those like 7 or 8, which ones were the most important, and then figuring out how to situate them so that they, built on each other as you read the whole collection. I thought a lot about story order also, right? What does reading one story about this thing and then encountering one of these short pieces about this other thing, is there some power or synergy there? Yeah.
Right, they're not between every story. There's sort of certain intervals that they come in. The Choose Your Own Adventure story, that was really pretty fascinating. And if people don't understand exactly what that is, if you weren't of that age when you read those, and I wasn't actually, it's a story where you get to the end of a section and you have a choice of what does the character do. If he does this, turn to page 190. If he does that, turn to page 192. And it creates different paths, almost like different stories within the story. Yeah. How did you arrive at doing that?
I mean, I wrote it in like kind of a fugue state. I really look at it now and I'm like, I don't know how I did this. Because it's the longest and the most complicated story in the collection for sure. But the idea came from a conversation with a friend who was trying to write a Choose Your Own Adventure short story about something else, and a discussion I had with her, my good friend Kirsten at Iowa. And then I had also read, I think around that time, Carmen Maria Machado's memoir that has this incredible, incredible section that's a really short Choose Your Own Adventure story. And then given the fact that I was reading a lot of the Goosebumps, Scare Yourself Silly or whatever they were called, as a child. And so it's a form I'd always been interested in. And because I'm interested in this idea of what if and, alternate paths or possibilities, it felt like the right way to talk about migration, which is, we talk about it as being about choice, but it's really not always, right? It's partially about choice, and it's also partially about the factors that force people to migrate. And that story allowed me to play around with that a little bit.
And very few of the choices are choices people make, because they want to.
Exactly, yeah.
They're put into a situation where they have to make a choice.
Yeah. And so that story, like a little spoiler, there's false choices. There's like a number of false choices as you read that story to kind of capture what I think is the reality of migration today.
Yeah. I mean, it's also the most realistic story, I would say, and the most powerful story. It's just amazing how many ways it can go wrong.
Yeah.
And how few it can go right.
Yeah. I don't think it's a cynical story, but it definitely, it was a balance to figure out how do I, like you said, it is pretty much the only fully realist, kind of not even hyperbolic. The invention there is the form a little bit. And so it was hard to figure out how to balance the reality of migration and a child who we're following, and their lack of autonomy, with the fact that I wanted to write a bunch of happy endings for that child, right? Like that's what I would have liked, but it also felt wrong to do that because that's not often how the story ends.
What's the significance of the title, which is not the title of any story, but it's in maybe, I think, the last alternate history? Yeah,
it's like a repeated line in the very, very last thing you read. I mean, I wrote the line first. I wrote that story, which, it's a story, but I was trying to, I admire poets, and so I was trying to play around with language a little bit. And I had that line, and I was sitting in my friend India Finch's apartment, and I had a different working title, and they knew that, and they were like, I think that's the title. And it was a gift to get that from them. And the reason I liked it is because I think it captures kind of the approach, right? There's the in heaven, which hints at the speculative and fantastical and otherworldly. And there's the Rio Grande, which is, maybe the most famous symbol of the U.S.-Mexico border that we have. And so it felt right. It felt like it captured my approach in some way.
You said that you kind of learned who you were as a writer through writing these stories, and I know you have a novel coming out soon. Are you going to continue to carry over this approach of exploring, more fantastic, alternative sorts of stories, or is this just this book?
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, okay, the novel does build on this. The novel is a multiverse novel about basically hinging on the life and or death of a guerrilla soldier. So thematically, in El Salvador during the 70s, late 70s. So thematically, I'm interested in a lot of the same things. I think I'll always probably use some kind of speculative tilt. I just think that the approach might change over time. Even the new, the new stories that I've been kind of working at have taken me some surprising places. But I think for most readers, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's Ruben. That's the kind of silly, weird, earnest mix of things that make a story, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. Our third and final finalist this evening, by the way, we go alphabetical order by last name, so if you ever wondered, is Jessi Jezewska Stevens. I asked Jessi before we started tonight, and I think she must have pronounced her name 25 times. So you can tell I'm not good at languages. The stories in Ghost Pains feature wry observations about contemporary life in Europe, where Jessi lives, and the US, where she's from. Her deft, arch, erudite, carefully crafted sentences manage to convey both a bemused perspective and a mood of existential dread. Though amusing sentence by sentence, these stories also pack a punch. Jessi.
Thank you. So I'm Jessi Jezewska Stevens. It's so delightful to be here. I'm going to read a little bit unorthodoxly from the middle of the titular story. So just to catch you up, our lead, Tina, is a tech consultant, and she's on her way to Poland for a job. She has an old flame and college friend named Dave, an old crush with whom she once had a very unfortunate threesome with his girlfriend, referred to as the new girl. She also has an unfortunate piercing that was made, a decision made while she was inebriated at the beginning of the story. So, the nipple piercing never really healed, by the way. That's what you get for choosing the only place open at 3 a.m. On the subway, Tina struck a protective stance. The pain was faint, but when it arrived, it yanked her back into the past, and always at unexpected moments. She took these as cosmic signs. Time to leave the city was what they said, and so, 5 years later, she did. Tina was good at her job. The transfer was hers for the taking when the opportunity arrived. So it was that, 5 years later again, she stepped out of Warsaw International and onto the train platform. She had in her pocket one first-class ticket. She was bound for Krakow, direct. No one else seemed to be headed to Krakow that day. The train was empty. She, of course, was traveling on business. The office wanted to know if Poland was the next Lithuania or Ukraine, that is, a cradle for startups, incubating world-class talent on discounted pay. She knew more about the country than most, true, but she also suspected she'd seemed the appropriate choice due to the consonants crammed into her name. Yes, both sides, she told her boss, Chicago and Detroit. Her other purpose for traveling was nostalgia of a type that didn't really belong to her. Gliding beneath the gray silk of the sky, through snowy fields, was this cabbage country or wheat? She tried to recall her grandfather's descriptions. One of the last things he'd said to her before he died was that being American meant she didn't have to dwell so much in the past. That was the advantage. Yes, she'd wanted to add, but couldn't they also have dwelt a little more? The doors of the train car opened with an automated poof, and a woman came down the aisle, very busy on her phone. Tina returned to the window. The contours of the war, as gleaned from her relatives, had only ever been revealed in the negative, a pattern scissored from the dossier of all the other, more practical things they'd said, that the one she'd met had said, that is. She pulled out her laptop. Traveling 40% of the time left one in a state of contemplative dislocation, conducive to reflections like these. It filled in the silence. The first thing she did after checking into her hotel was to buy a pack of cigarettes and wander over the cobblestones to the nearest bar, where she ordered 2 fried discs of mountain cheese. A Pilsner arrived. The beer was blonde, the wood was blonde, and so was the waitress who brought her food. A soccer match was on, and she watched the jerseys flash white and ruby across the screen. Eating alone is a consultant's art, and key criteria include a view of the television in proximity to a table whose conversation carries in a language you can understand. That night, Tina found herself adjacent to an animated set speaking in English to accommodate the single American, a student studying abroad. She ate very slowly. The wrong team scored. The party next to her was becoming increasingly inflamed over the Iraq War. The American cursed his own government. The Poles, his allies, cursed theirs. On screen, white rallied and the game was tied. Fans at the bar raised their glasses and cheered. It was into this commotion that the door swung wide, trailing a swirl of snow. The man who entered was smartly dressed and vaguely familiar. His clothes cut so close that at first she mistook him for Swiss or French. His gait, however, betrayed the far-flung tourist's hesitance. The shoulders slumped. She realized then she'd seen those shoulders before, for an entire semester of linear algebra, in fact. Also, far more intimately, wedged between the new girl's thighs. Before she knew it, before all available options had been properly weighed, as might befit a consultant of her experience, Tina had ducked beneath the table, as soundlessly as a swimmer pulled under a wave. Tina hadn't seen Dave in a long while, not since the attempt to torpedo his relationship had, she could admit it now, succeeded only in sinking herself. Perhaps she was mistaken? From under the table, she watched the waitress's white pumps click across the floorboards as her half-finished plate was whisked away. The cheese, that was a shame. Fans cheered as someone scored. She'd have to watch the replay. It was part of her job to keep up with sports. She breathed in the sticky Pilsner scent. Despite her extensive HR training, Tina had never fully bought into trigger warnings, or at the very least had supposed them tangential to her own experience. Everyone had close calls. And yet, here she was, under a table in a foreign country, hands wrapped around her knees, a cheap ring stamping itself unattractively onto her forehead. A pair of practical boots appeared, replacing the waitress's pumps. Tina? Oh, hello. Dave looked at her for a long moment. I thought that was you, he said. There are certain people for whose arrival one would like to be prepared. Hitler, your mother-in-law, yourself, when you're high and suddenly confronted by a mirror. The best you can do is to be constantly on guard against such unpleasantness, over-prepared to be shocked, and therefore not, when the moment finally arrives. The thing to do was act naturally, as if the past had never happened. Great to see you, Tina said. She accepted his hand, and his invitation followed him to the bar. They sipped in silence. Another game passed. When the match finished, there was nothing to do but stare at the ads. Dave had been supporting the losing team, and because their last meeting had not ended on especially fine terms, Tina had pretended to support them too. Now they both had lost. Well, fuck. Brutal, she agreed. He asked her what she was doing here in Krakow, and she explained for too long, lingering over all the mind-numbing details. The startups, the talent search, the race to hire the best from this part of the world before competing firms caught on. She hadn't imagined winding up in headhunting. It sounded so violent. I'm not exactly a people person, she said, that he knew. But compared to most programmers, I guess I seem emotionally intelligent. What about you? Dave stared at the foam at the bottom of his mug. Restitution for my grandfather's apartment. He died last month, so. At a loss for what to say, Tina ordered another Pilsner. A tooth-whitening ad bleached the screen. Cigarette? He took one. Later, when she reached for her purse, he placed a hand on hers. A few zloty fell to the blonde wood. Please, he said. Honestly, it's good to see someone.
That was very funny. Do you feel that people, do you encounter people who don't really understand that there's a lot of humor in the book?
Luckily, not yet. They might be out there, but the humor in this book is important to me and in all of my writing, yeah.
And do you find that some of your best jokes don't get laughs and some of the other ones do?
Maybe it could also be due to my reading or my acting. The writing, of course, is very funny, always. No. Yeah.
One thing interesting about your book and the way it was published is if you hold it up maybe for a moment. When that came across my desk, the beginning of the story is on the cover of the book. Which I had seen before, but, and I thought, wow, what a great cover design. But this publisher does that for every book, right?
Yes, and I think that this book was one of the very first to receive this new outfit, and Other Stories now publishes the first sentences of the book. And I was excited about that. It has also forever changed my relationship to the first sentences of books, to note, because I had sold the manuscript, we had finalized the book before this cover decision was made. So it felt serendipitous, but it really has made me think very much about openings, because they could be emblazoned, in fact, across the cover of your next book.
Did that affect your choice of what the first story would be?
The first story was always the party, so these were always the opening lines, yeah.
That's interesting, because I could see it being something where you would just go back and forth, which would be the best sentence to be on the cover of the book.
I guess with the timing, I was luckily spared this very anxious-making kind of decision, yeah.
So you're just, I think, to explain the publisher, this is a publisher based in UK called And Other Stories.
Yeah.
How did you end up, working with them?
So my first editor, who's been my only editor for all three books, my first novel was with FSG, and Jeremy M. Davies was my editor there, and he had moved to And Other Stories. And so for my second novel and for this collection, we continued to work together. It was during COVID, and I think lots of strange things were happening in publishing, and Other Stories was briefly publishing in the US, and that was very lucky for me because it was this perfect fit, and I got to continue to work with this really excellent editor.
You live in Europe. Did having a book published in UK as opposed to the US, do you feel like that gave you more access to readers in Europe than a purely American published book would?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I was very glad to also reach readers in the UK. Although living on the continent, Brexit has made it very difficult to find English books. But yeah, I was very glad to kind of reach a new audience with this publisher. Mm-hmm.
How would you describe this book, as a book? Like, what if someone asked you, what is this story collection about? What would you say?
So I think that the passage that I read from this titular story gets to the main theme that was on my mind, which was how to live with history better. One doesn't want to live always in the past, to give in to nostalgia, the temptations of which or have been quite dominant, in our conversations recently in the U.S. One also doesn't want to escape totally into the future, into the perpetual restart, into perpetual forgetting, which I think tech appears in a few of these stories, and I think that kind of perspective is captured by the presence of tech and the tech characters. And I was thinking a lot about some of the most pressing conversations that we've been having in the US, also in Europe, and how so many of them seem to really come down to this question of how do we live with things that cannot be reconciled, things that cannot be undone, and how do we live with that history better? And it's complicated, and it's difficult. And I think in all of these stories, I often have a pair of people who are both kind of reckoning with history, even often from opposite sides of some kind of a calamity. And there's something in those situations that felt both very contemporary to me, and that felt like something that fiction could really offer in a polarized moment, in a moment that so quickly reaches for the kind of the black and the white explanation.
What led you to move to Europe, and how has that perspective informed your writing?
So I had received a fellowship to go to Berlin for the year, and at the same time that my husband had taken a new job in Europe. So that was kind of serendipitous. And I grew up in Indiana. I'm deeply American. I feel like my relationship to work is incredibly American. But the sense that there's a lot of humor in being an expat, how do I work this ATM more, I definitely am lost and misunderstood, what someone just said to me in German, but I'm going to pretend that I understood. And so all of these kinds of frictions are there's so much potential for humor. But the perspective of the expat, or even there are stories set in the US where you can be a stranger in your own country.
Right.
And I think there's something in that perspective that also interests me, both for the lightness and the potential for humor of being an outsider, but also for that sense of discovery that comes with being new. Yeah. And I think that is a perspective that many of the stories adopt. Displacement
sort of makes you notice things.
Yeah.
Because they're unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that is true. There's a story that takes place in the American South, which I think to many Northerners or Midwesterners is the equivalent of another country.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this came from...
Oh, by the way, the backers of this prize are from the South, so let's be careful.
You know, this came from, so I grew up in Indiana, and since then my parents have moved to North Carolina, and I of course didn't grow up there, and you know, now visit them there, and I visited often during the pandemic, and I would drive down from New York, where I lived, yeah, I think it became, I mean, so much is so familiar, but it was also on my mind that, oh, I actually haven't spent time at all in this part of the country before, and how interesting that, you know, I moved a lot as a kid growing up, and yet here is a part of the country that I actually don't know very well. And, you know, in my early 30s, I can still be a stranger in my own country and discover so much. And so that story, Gettysburg, had come up from those road trips that I was doing during the pandemic.
There's another story called Siberia that is, it's almost like in the pandemic, but it's in the story, it's in a country where you can't leave your apartment because there's a civil war going on. Was that something that you were trying to do in relation to experiencing the pandemic, or was that something that you've actually experienced?
Yeah, it did come out of, it's laced with pandemic, I would say. And that story is, there are two people, there's kind of an unconsummated love affair, and there is this war on, and they cannot meet, but they're on the phone the whole time. And so it's this extended phone conversation between these two lovers. And I think that during the pandemic, I was extremely interested in how virtual our lives became, the kind of the distances, but also the strange intimacies of these new ways of speaking to each other. You know, we had Zoom meetings and Zoom dates and all kinds of other ways of trying to reach out. And a friend of mine had gotten in the habit of hopping around Google Maps, and he would read, for example, you know, reviews of like McDonald's in Siberia, you know, and was traveling far and wide. And this is something that comes up in the story too. These two people traveling, actually, in a way, through you know, hopping around on the map. And so a lot of our relationships to interfacing in these new ways was part of the inspiration for that story.
Do you see a progression in the book? Like, how did you decide what order to put the stories in, and you know, why the first story's first, the last story's last, and so forth?
Yeah, I was asking myself that when you asked Fiona the same question. It's always, you know, it's always the question that hovers over a story collection.
Right.
I did think about balance. I mean, the first story, and which is on the cover of the book, is the first story I ever published. And it also has the kernel or the seed of this central theme. There is a party that is a failure in for multiple reasons. One is that it's crashed by a screaming dog that seems to have the scream of history that really freaks out all of the guests. And I did end up developing that theme, I think, through all of the other stories. So it felt fitting for it to come first. And then something else that was on my mind was balance of tone. Some of the stories, such as Siberia, maybe also Ghost Pains, can be heavier, a bit darker, also longer. And I tried to find some balance in the collection between some of the lighter stories with some of the weightier and maybe even more painful stories.
Right. The sentences are very precise. Does that come naturally to you, or are you constantly reworking the sentences to get that effect and, you know, the right the right rhythm, the right word choice, the word that will make the joke come across.
I feel like my agent would tell me to say, the first draft is always, it was the perfect sentence. But no, I care a lot about rhythm, and I care a lot about word choice. I think that humor is also a lot about timing and precision. And so I really rework sentences. And I think my editor also has a great ear and also really lives for a really excellent sentence. And so, you know, I think one of the joys of working together has been, you know, there's another novel going on in the comments when we're going over a draft, because we can really go back and forth about a single word choice, because I think it still matters to me, yeah.
And some of the words are in German or other languages. I don't know if there are other languages.
I think just German, yeah. There's maybe a bisou in here, a little French kiss. But otherwise, just German, yeah.
I was looking things up, and then it would be like chocolate granola.
Yeah.
It seems so mysterious.
There are some grocery lists, yes. Yeah. Hopefully there's enough context. There are enough context clues that we don't have to always go looking them up. But now you have this delightful fact that there is.
It's one of the best things, I think, about reading short stories, especially, you know, these three. I did a lot of looking up. I read every collection twice to prepare for this, so it's really more the second time. I'm not slowing myself down to look things up, but I think it adds a certain value that you have to engage with the book in that way, and because you can do it. So I don't know, do you do that when you read? If you come across a word in another language or something unfamiliar?
Do I stop and look things up?
Yeah.
I do, actually, maybe a bit obsessively. Part of this is because as I was writing this book, I was learning additional languages and had a lot of enthusiasm for this. And I read now more and more often in German, where I certainly have to look things up. I think that maybe this relates back to the precision of sentences and attention to language as well. That especially, I think that this has always been important to my writing, but especially while writing these stories, I really was discovering this joy of learning languages kind of later in life. So I look a lot of things up, but maybe it's also even strengthened my attention to word choice and to syntax.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Up here one more time. Thank you, Jessi. Before we announce the winner of the Story Prize, let's hear it again for all three writers. Any one of them would be a deserving winner, and that's what we, look for when we put together our list of finalists. Listening to you read from your work and discuss writing has been illuminating and inspiring. Now, Jay Lindsay, president of the Chisholm Foundation, based in Mississippi, will announce the 20th winner of the Story Prize.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm sorry the evening has to end. The Chisholm Foundation is really proud to have been able to support and sponsor this award and this celebratory evening for 20 plus years. And I think this evening is a great illustration of why we find this so very, very valuable. I'd also like to congratulate the three finalists, Fiona, Jessi, and Ruben. And I'd like to thank the judges who had the very, very difficult task of making a choice. I'm pleased to announce the winner, but before I do, I would like to acknowledge our friends at Really Useful Media for making this event available to people that can't attend in person. And I'd like to also have a special shout out to Larry Dark, the director of the Story Prize. Larry, thank you for the work that you and Asher put in to prepare for this evening, and also for your fantastic interviews. So without further ado, let me invite our winner forward, and that is for Highway 13, Fiona McFarlane.
Thank you so much. Well, hello again. We were instructed to write something. Let me find it right now. One of my favorite quotes about the short story comes from Flannery O'Connor, which is the peculiar problem of the short story writer is to reveal as much of the mystery of existence as possible. I terrify my students with this quote quite often. Right now I'm feeling quite a lot of that mystery of existence myself. When you send a book of short stories out in the world, you're never quite sure what will become of it. And I'm very grateful that this particular book has brought me here. Being on this shortlist alone was already an incredible honour. My sincere admiration goes to my fellow nominees, Jessi and Ruben. I am so proud to be in your company. An enormous thank you to the judges for selecting this very Australian book about a serial killer of all things, or not really about a serial killer. To prize director Larry Dark and to Asher Dark, thank you so much. To Julie Lindsay, to Jay Lindsay, and to the Chisholm Foundation, thank you so much for honouring short stories as you do, and for acknowledging the aesthetic and intellectual and emotional pleasure that we get from reading them and from writing them. To my publisher, Mitzi Angel, and everyone at FSG, also Milo, who helped bring this book to life and into the hands of readers. Thank you. To my agent, Stephanie Cabot, who has championed my work for over 20 years. You are a powerhouse and a goddess. To my dear friend Fatima Kola, who's here tonight and was one of the earliest readers of these stories. I couldn't ask for a better friend and cheerleader. And thank you to Emma Jones, who is thousands of miles away in Bath, in the United Kingdom right now, but is present in every single word of this book. Thank you once again to the Story Prize for this wonderful honour. I couldn't be more delighted. Thank you.